السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. سعادة الدكتور عبدالله محمد الريس، مدير عام الأرشيف الوطني، السادة الضيوف، أيها الحضور الكريم، نحييكم ونرحب بكم أجمل ترحيب، ونحن نلتقي في الأرشيف الوطني ذاكرة الوطن لنتابع معا ندوة بعنوان مستقبل السجلات الرقمية الدائمة في ظل الحكومة الذكية. إن حفظ السجلات الرقمية كدليل قانوني في الحاضر وفي المستقبل ضروري جدا. ولما كانت البروفيسورة لويزيانا دورانتي قد عرفت بتخصصها على مستوى العالم في مجال حفظ السجلات في البيئة الرقمية، فإننا ندعوها لتحدثنا عن حفظ السجلات الإلكترونية الأصلية على المدى الطويل، فلتتفضل مشكورة.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the National Archives and Dr. Abdullah in particular for having invited me. This is my very first time in the United Arab Emirates, and it has been such a joy to be here every day. All right, so I will start my presentation today by quoting the author of the very first text in archival science written worldwide, Baldassarre Bonifacio, from the Republic of Venice, who in 1632 said the records and archives are useful for instructing and teaching men, for clearing up and illustrating obscure matters, for conserving patrimonies and thrones, all things public and private, as they're much better than navy yards, much more efficacious than munitions factories, as it is finer to win by reason than by violence, by right than by wrong. But in fact, we keep archives also because we have a duty of historical accountability to the next generations. And we speak of historical accountability when we use the records to account to the future generations for our actions in the present, and so that they can know them and learn from them and maybe leave behind whatever weight they may have created on them. So, however, while archives have existed for thousands of years, the digital challenge makes it very difficult to continue operating in an archival field as we used to do with traditional records. And this challenge is due in part to the nature of the digital records, on which I will elaborate later on. It has to do with establishing the accuracy, reliability, and authenticity of digital records, but also maintaining it over time in such a way that those who wish to verify it are able to do so. Because if you think about it, it is useless to have authentic records if you can't prove that they are authentic. Also, there is the need for developing an infrastructure that ensures that there is a seamless, controlled flow of authentic data, documents, and records from the creator to the preserver, regardless of changes that might happen in technology and of technological obsolescence. We need to provide transparency on the actions of government, of employees, primarily because employees are accountable to their own administration. The administration is accountable to the people. And again, we have these legal requirements of providing evidence of our actions. But at the same time, governments need to protect secrecy where it is appropriate. So there is this conflict between transparency and secrecy that becomes harder to resolve in a digital environment, as well as to resolve other conflicting rights of the users of the records, of clients, employees, and future generations. So beyond the conflict between transparency and secrecy, we do have in the digital environment an exasperation of the conflict between free access to everything and the protection of the privacy of individuals, as well as between the right to acquire knowledge and economic rights of those who produce such knowledge, between the need to disseminate information and the need to maintain the integrity of the work, the records as produced. And we know very well that in the digital environment, dissemination implies reproduction, which involves change. And when this change harms the integrity of the material, the moral rights of the others are infringed. We also have a conflict between memory, the right of society to preserve a memory of themselves, but also the right of the people to be forgotten if they wish so. And we know that this conflict is extremely exacerbated in Europe, where the right to be forgotten is going to become law within a month or so, and it seriously conflicts with the right of access to a permanent memory. So the right to have a heritage and the right to forget. And the biggest challenge is, in fact, ensuring the permanent preservation of the documentary cultural heritage in digital form. So let's go to the first issue, the nature of the digital records. Why preservation is such a challenge? Well, digital records are vulnerable. They're easy to delete, they're easy to lose, to corrupt, to tamper with, to become inaccessible if they're not properly protected. But at the same time, we also know that the best way of ensuring the maintenance and preservation of records is redundancy. That is, making multiple copies that exist at the same time in different systems. But what does that mean? It means that while digital records are vulnerable, they're also persistent. That is, it is very difficult to delete them for good. It is easy to eliminate a link to them, but not to permanently obliterate them, unless they are purposefully destroyed at the time when they must be destroyed by the creating body or the archives inheriting them. Also, in digital records, content data, structured data, form data are not inextricably linked as they are on traditional records. So you get your piece of paper, and together with it you get content which is structured in a meaningful way, and it has a specific documentary form that conveys meaning per se. So with traditional records, at a glance, we can say, this is a letter, this is a memorandum, this is a contract. But this is no longer true in the digital environment, because the data related to form, content, and composition are actually separate and need different separate preservation measures. Also, the record as a stored entity is different from what we see on the screen, from its manifestation, because digital records are made up of digital components. And what we actually preserve are the separate components and the links among them. For example, if you take an email may have a header, a message, a digital signature, a picture attached. All those parts, when we close an email, end up in different parts of the system. And those are the things that we actually need to preserve. When we save a record, we take it apart in its digital component. When we retrieve the record, we reproduce it, creating a copy. What does that mean? It means that we cannot preserve digital records. We can only preserve our capacity to reproduce it if all we do is to assemble together the digital components, or recreate it if in fact we have a database and we need to use a specific query to generate the same outcome. So we have to respect certain principles if we want to be able to maintain digital records over time and preserve them. So the first principle that we have to keep in mind is that we cannot assess the authenticity of a record on the object itself. So with traditional records, we take the ink that we examine the medium, we look at the carbon-14 test, we look at how the script was, and we can date a record and we can verify its authenticity. This is no longer possible in the digital environment. The record is always green, is always new, and it is composed. It is made up of two separate entities, what is stored in the system and what you see on the screen. So in order to assess the authenticity of a record, we need to infer it, to deduce it from the environment in which it exists, from the environment in which it was created, maintained, used, and preserved. In fact, in much evidence legislation these days, the new laws say that you establish the integrity of a document submitted as evidence if you can actually prove the integrity of the system in which the document existed. And note that with traditional records, when we talk about authenticity, we usually refer to the identity of the record. So with a paper record, if we can prove that it came from a specific author or organization, then we say it is authentic. In the digital environment, that's not good enough. In the digital environment, you have also to prove that it has not been changed. So identity and integrity are two necessary components of authenticity. The second principle you have to keep in mind is that you cannot let technology tell you what the solution is to the reliable and accurate creation of digital records, or to their preservation over the long term. It must not be technology driven. It must be driven by your needs and requirements, by archival principles. And then the technology will adjust to those. Furthermore, the solution to the digital record challenges are inherently dynamic, which means that the solution that I have today and works perfectly well, it is now going to work tomorrow. And these solutions are also specific. They are specific to the culture of the society, to the culture of the organization, to the discipline to which the records refer. So, for example, if we're talking about medical records, they have different requirements than financial records or legal records. And they're specific to administrative situations and to legal situations. Furthermore, when we introduce in organization systems like document management systems or content management system, etc., we tend to think that the important thing to do is to teach employees how to use the structural features of such a system. Well, that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is that the employees understand the spirit behind those features, behind those requirements. And this means that when systems are chosen, they're not chosen because the IT department says so. They're chosen because all the levels of the organizations are consulted on the way in which they carry out their activity, on the way in which they need to work, on what the procedures are, the processes are, and so on. And a technology is chosen on that basis. And in fact, it has been proven over and over again that with digital systems developed by IT experts without consultation with the archives, the records loss and corruption happens much more frequently. Primarily because, and this is the overall principles that should guide all digital preservation, preservation starts at creation or even before creation of the records. So for a government, preservation of permanent records is a continuous process that begins with records creation and needs to be controlled by the National Archives. So we have to think of archives as the trusted custodian. What is a trusted custodian? It is an entity which acts as a neutral third party. So this is necessary because of the fragility of the digital records. And if the records are left in the hands of those who have a stake in their content, if they realize that their actions had not been really as appropriate as they should have been, it takes nothing for them to eliminate those records. That's why as soon as activities are completed by the creators, the record should move in the hands of a party that has no reason to alter them and will not allow anybody to alter the records, either accidentally or on purpose. Also, this must be an entity which has the knowledge and the skills necessary to fulfill its responsibilities, and these knowledge and skills should be acquired through formal education. And they should be able to establish a trusted preservation system which is capable of ensuring that accurate and authentic copies of the records are acquired and preserved. So why do I say copies of the records? Because again, you cannot preserve digital records. What you do is to create authentic copies over and over and over again. So you want a third responsible party who is knowledgeable and competent to create authentic copies of the records of the creator in the digital form that is consistent with the technological environment of the archives. And specifically, what else does the archives as a trusted custodian must do? Well, as I said, an archive has to position itself at the beginning of the record's life cycle. It has to assess the authenticity of the records at the beginning of the life cycle and must monitor it throughout their existence. So it is very important that archivists sit with the records manager, or that the records manager has the same education as the archivist and fulfills the function of assessing the authenticity of the records in the system, but the records made and those received from an external party, and then monitor changes. You understand that every time a live system is upgraded, its content is changed. At least the metadata is changed at a minimum. Often also the form of the records is changed. So every time there is an upgrade of the system, it's really important that the archivist verifies that the record has maintained the authenticity, because the essential components of the records have remained intact, even if other parts might have changed. The archives need to identify the records to be permanently preserved at the moment of their creation, because they need to have special care. Of course, at that stage, you have to make a very conservative evaluation, because you don't really know over time what it is that, what else you might need. But it is important, therefore, that appraisal, that is the assessment of what is to be preserved and for how long, keeps going on as a continuous process that only ends when the archives transfer happens, the definitive transfer to the archival institution happens. So during the time between the first appraisal of the records and the transfer to the archives, it is essential that archivists periodically monitor transformations through conversions and migrations over time. Let me give you an example, which is a practical example. At the University of British Columbia, the registry system for the students has been upgraded a number of times and has been migrated to a different technology over time. Now, when it was migrated to the last technology, this technology could offer many more functionalities than the previous ones. So several offices of the university decided that they could actually use the student registration system to fulfill other functions that never had been linked to them. So not just the function of assigning them marks and getting them through the course of studies, but for example, of finding out from where students with scholarships come, find out what the religions of the various students are, so that they can decide on the holidays during the terms, and so on. So other information, also information needed to recruit more students in the future. So a series of different offices started to use a system that was conceived for registering the students. But now, all this data can be manipulated to serve different functions. What does that mean? It means that you have to conduct appraisal at this stage no longer on the system per se, what it is that I preserve, but from the point of view of each office that uses it. Because for each office, different sets of data are necessary to continue to carry out their functions within that system. So you see that you have the same content evaluated several times from different perspectives with a different outcome. So while certain records from the point of view of one office wouldn't be preserved, from the point of view of another would. So you see how important it is that the archives monitors every change that occurs over time, because that may have an enormous impact on what evidence needs to be preserved and how. Also, the archives needs to determine the feasibility of the preservation of the records on the basis of the technological capacity of the archives. So certainly the archives must be able to preserve a variety of formats, a variety of media, but not everything, because you want to normalize the material that comes within the technological environment of the archives. So when the archival personnel looks at the records that are being generated by an organization, an agency, a creator, has to look at its ability to preserve these records in that form in which they're created. Because if it is not able to, the conversion to other formats, it's better that it happens in the course of business. So whatever is built over those records will be consistent and there will be no loss. Also, the archives needs to determine a preservation strategy as soon as possible for every set of records that decides to preserve. And this strategy needs to be based on standards and on the findings of research, and should maintain a focus on compatibility of the records and systems and interoperability. Interoperability not only synchronic, that is, of the system that exists among themselves, but also diachronic, that is, over time. They have to control the accuracy of the records after each conversion and migration. You have no idea how many records have been lost because there has been no checking after conversion and migration that the records were accurate. And accuracy, which is the precision and correctness of individual data, it's very easy to lose as the digital records are moved from a format to another, from a system to another, from an hardware to another. Also, an archives needs to develop procedures that address issues of intellectual rights, secrecy, and privacy, and it has to recognize that the function of archival description has become one of authentication. Because in the traditional environment, the way in which the records accumulated authenticated them in a way, because you could see what record existed before and what records was after. And it is this documentary context, this archival bond, we call it in archival theory, that gives the meaning to the record. But in the digital environment, the physical location of the records is random. So what you need to do is to describe the context of the records in an explicit way. And that description of how the records related to each other is what authenticates them. If over time you see the records in a different context, then you know that something has happened to them. And of course, this means that, all that I have said means that the archives must be involved in research and development. Just like every industry has done over time, archives cannot just wait that the research that is carried out by academics and other professionals arrives to fruition and generates new products. By that time, they've lost the train. They have to participate in the research while it goes on, not only because they would be able to constantly guide this research, but also because they would be aware of changes as it happens immediately. So, of course, they have to look at standards, and they have also to compare the standard setters, those who set standards. They are not equally important, they not all have equal relevance, not all are equally useful. So, for example, one of the most famous standards for records management, actually the most famous standard for records management, it was the first and it is still the foundation of every other standard that exists, is the Department of Defense, DoD 5015.2, which was issued by the federal government of the United States and is a de jure standard for the United States, which means is a requirement for every agency of the United States, but it is a de facto standard for the rest of the world. That is not a standard approved by governments in the rest of the world, but it is the one that everyone uses. Then there is the DLM Forum standard, which is called MOREC, Model Requirements for Record Keeping, and it has 3 versions, MOREC, MOREC 2, and MOREC 10. MOREC 10 is a specification, which means that actually it becomes an actual system. It is transformed into code. So MOREC 10 can be certified, and it is certified by the DLM Forum. DoD, you can be DoD compliant, that is that you respect the main principles of DoD, but systems can be certified by DoD. So for example, the document management system of Australia, TRIM, that is produced by Tower, is DoD certified. Now, ARMA is a very interesting standard producer because ARMA is the Association of Records Management and Records Managers and Administrators, is an international association, although it is based in the United States, and not only produce standards in very specific areas, such as managing email, such as dealing with the cloud, but as soon as it produces the standard, it issues a technical specification. That is, it tells you how to implement it. Now, ARMA standards cost money, unless you are a member of ARMA, which most records managers should be. ISO is the International Organization for Standardization. These are standards produced through a very elaborate process by representatives of every country in the world. One of the negative aspects of ISO is that it takes a long time to issue a standard. And by the time it is out, especially with things which are technologically sensitive, like digital preservation, the relevance is relative. Object Management Group is an international membership-based, not-for-profit organization which is composed of private and public bodies like National Archives, Boeing, any big company you can think of, which together find agreements on very technical standards, and they operate in a very rigorous way and very fast with respect to anybody else. The ICA is the International Council on Archives and issues standards as well, which usually tend to sum up other standards that have been produced by others. For example, ISAT, the standard for description, is a remaking of the Canadian standard for archival description in a much lighter way. For example, the standard for record keeping is a remaking of a bit of the ISO records management standard, a bit of DoD, a bit of MOREC, and so on. So it doesn't really have contributions that come out from research, but it's good in putting together what exists and relatively fast. The problem is that the standards are behind a membership wall, which means if you're not a member, you cannot access them. NIST and CGSB. Those are two national organizations, the first for the United States and the other for Canada. What national organization standards do is that they are very specific. Because they are acting within a well-known context that is shared by all the users, it is very easy to be specific in these standards. And that's why they tend to be more useful than the international one, because they use the international standard as basis, but they can go much further than that. And then there are the standards which are generated by research teams, like, well, the UBC DoD produced the DoD standard. But for example, NASA and APARSEN produced the Open Archival Information System standard. The OIS standard is the fundamental standard for preservation, which has not been generated by archivists. It has been generated by physicists, astrophysicists, and which is not for the use of archivists, but is for the use of scientific communities. But archivists have used it well as a conceptual foundation on which then to build specific things. And then, of course, there is Inter Pares, and that's what I'm going to talk about. So the Inter Pares project is a research that I have conducted since 1998 in reality. We got the money in 99, but we started in 98. So Inter Pares means International Research on Permanent Authentic Records in Electronic Systems. The purpose of the very first two phases of Inter Pares was in fact to create theory and methods which did not exist for records that at the time were called electronic records. And now they're digital records, but the idea was to in fact have a framework of principles, of concepts, of methodologies that could be consistently applied worldwide for all kinds of records, databases, office systems, dynamic systems, for example, geographic information system, experiential systems, and interactive system for any kind of activity. So we looked at the preservation of, for example, of electroacoustic music, of works of arts, of film, of photographs, the products of e-government, and the products of artistic and scientific activities. Okay, and when we finished with these two projects, well, then people who have no money came to us and said, well, okay, all those rules and all those methods and all those principles can be easily applied by organizations that have lots of money. But what about those organizations that don't? How are we going to deal with it? So what we did was to create a research project that scaled down all what we had produced for the previous project so that it could be used by organizations that had not all the knowledge, not the people, not the technology, but could still do something to preserve authentic records. And this project produced an enormous amount of case studies that could be looked at on the website, and they're all available. The research of Inter Pares 3, that is all the application of the findings of Inter Pares 1 and 2 to a variety of realities, was based on the products of Inter Pares 1 and 2 that are still very useful. So one product was the policy framework, which is a set of principles for records creators and records preservers that must be respected as they design their policies. The other is the creator's guideline, which is basically a guidance for all those who cannot afford the records manager on how to create the records in a way that they can be maintained and preserved and remain accessible for the long time. Now, these creators' guidelines we generated, in fact, for small firms that couldn't afford personnel, but they have been mostly used by government agencies because apparently they are the kind of guidance that they need. Now, these products are actually accessible and not copyrighted on our website, and you can download them. You can print these booklets using Flash exactly the way they are, and by all means do so. This is the table of content of the Creators Guidelines, which discuss how you select software, hardware, and file formats, how you make sure that the content of the record remains stable, that the form is fixed, how you ensure the identification of records among all kinds of data, the integrity of records, what are the authentication techniques for maintenance and preservation, how you protect records from unauthorized action, from accidental loss or corruption, from obsolescence, etc., and how you prepare them for long-term preservation. We also produced the preserver guidelines, and these are mostly used not by those for whom they were written, who were basically small archives of maybe small universities or communities, but they're mostly used by national archives all over the world because obviously sum up well whatever is needed. And what they include is how to establish a digital preservation program, all the considerations that you have to make, how you appraise digital records throughout their life, how you transfer the permanent records to the archive's custody as soon as possible, how you process them, that is, how you normalize them for the technological environment of the archives, while at the same time maintaining formats that facilitate access. How you create archival descriptions, how you store them in a trusted repository, and how you convert and migrate them. We also produced the requirements for authenticity. These are actually the document that is most used by everybody worldwide. And they are both for creators and for preservers, and basically outline all the rules that you have to follow to make sure that you can make an inference of authenticity. And this is the list of the requirements for those who want to look at that. I understand that this PowerPoint is translated into Arabic, so you will have access to it. There is no need for me to read them. Another product was a file format selection guideline, which also is very much used. It discusses what an open file format is, what a standard format is, what a stable format is. It explains the criteria that you have to use to select the formats that you want. And here is a list of possible criteria. It discusses the policy implications of your choice. It makes recommendations for developing and implementing policies. And of course, it has many case studies. We have a terminology database. This terminology database includes a glossary, which is the definition of the terms used by the research project in the way in which they are used in that context only. These same terms then are defined in the dictionary with all the existing definitions taken from other glossaries and other dictionaries. And then we created ontologies. That is, we took the most important terms and we put them into relationship. So we have an ontology related to trustworthiness, one related to originals versus copies versus drafts, etc., one related to the concept of record, and so on. This terminology database on the website is translated in many languages, not in Arabic, but is in this moment being translated into Arabic. It did become the ICA multi-language terminology database. Then we have 2 records management models. As the students who are present here might know, and as the archivists surely know, there is a sort of tension on whether in records management we should go with the life cycle management or with the continuum, which is the proposal advanced by the Australians. And because our research project doesn't give preference to a specific ideology in archival science, we created 2 separate models. Those who prefer the life cycle follow the chain of preservation model that outlines and describes and represents every step in the workflow from the moment the records are generated to final preservation and dissemination. And the other one, the business-driven record-keeping model, represents the Australian concept of the continuum, where there is no sequence of activity, but all the activities on the records are carried out at the same time when the records are generated. And then there are the 2 books produced by those projects, which are available online to everybody completely. We had many journal studies. I don't need to read through them, but examples, of course, are related to a template. We created a template for producing a records management policy and procedure. We created cost-benefit models, ethical models. We have a wonderful case study and then report on open source records management software, on metadata application profiles, and so on. We have reports on Web 2 and social media. One thing that Interpares has done over time has been to incorporate within its own work the work of all the other research projects in the world, so that, in fact, everything is in there. We can't say it's us and it's them. It's all together. And all the research projects on preservation that exist out there are actually partners of Interpares. We have issued rules, guidelines for the preservation of email, for the preservation of registries, and very important for you might be the educational modules on digital preservation, which can be used to give in-house courses in archival institutions. They can be used to give a 3-day workshop for whoever wanted, to give an entire university course. They are translated in several languages. They are available on the ICA section on archival education website, and they are being translated into Arabic. For each of the modules, there are 8 modules. For each module, there is an explanation of the objectives, methodology, case studies, exercises, bibliographies, etc. On the website, which you can see there is also a video that explains how to use them in detail. And this is the structure. So these are the various modules that include how to develop a policy, how do you deal with organizational culture, the metadata, the appraisal, adopt, governed, email, websites, the cloud. It's everything related to preservation, really. Impact. Well, the legislation of Italy and China is based on the findings of Interpares. In fact, the one of China is the translation of the authenticity requirements. Those standards that you see listed there all incorporates the findings of Interpares. All participating countries have developed policies and procedures on that basis. And of course, there are the ICA education modules, a multilingual archival database. You can find all the products on the website, www.interpares.org. New challenges. Okay, so those three products those three phases of Interpares ended in 2012. And at that point, we thought we knew everything about digital preservation. We're done. We have solved the problems of the world. Everybody can apply them in a scalable way. And then the cloud came on us. And we realized that we had to start all over again because records creators were creating records in a cloud, in an online environment. And they did it so for backup, for collaboration, for distribution, for interaction with the citizens, for record keeping, for storage, for archives, whatever the reason is, everybody is putting their records in the cloud. So we created the fourth phase of Interpares, which is Interpares Trust, started in 2013, and it ends in December 2018. And its purpose is to create an international framework of principles, concepts, policies, procedures, rules, which will control consistency, the maintenance of records in the cloud from creation to preservation. It is a large alliance. There is a North American team, a Latin American team, Europe, Asia, Australasia, Africa, and then there is a team of transnational organizations. That is, those organizations which do not fit within the law of one country. UNESCO, NATO, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the Red Cross, the Atomic Energy, the Development Agency, you name them. They all work together as a team. Then we have supporting partners who are those who do not do any research with us, but have taken responsibility for disseminating our research. So the International Council on Archives, IFLA is one of those, and there are several of these organizations. Then we have pro bono consultants for very specific issues. There are experts out there in the world who volunteer to work with us on those issues for free. And there are international research projects that work with us, like the International Alliance for Access, APARCEN, etc. 40 countries, 300 researchers. You're very welcome if you want to play with us, to work with us. So this is all I have to say. I hope that there will be a time when I will report on the findings of the fourth phase of Interpares, but at this point, I am open to take any questions. Thank you.
نشكر البروفيسورة دورانتي على المعلومات القيمة التي أثرت بها محاضرتها والتي تدل على أهمية المشروع. واسمحوا لنا الآن أن ندعو الدكتور إيان ويلسون الخبير الفني في الأرشيف الوطني ليحدثنا عن سياسة الحكومة والسجلات الإلكترونية. فليتفضل.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies. It's a great morning. Many things are happening. I think we've just had a major challenge, but also a suggestion that there are solutions. I'd also like to begin by welcoming students and faculty from the higher colleges of technology. I know the HCT is on a break last week and this week, but when we indicated that Dr. Durante would be here this morning to talk, the students, faculty came in from the break and wanted to participate. So you're delighted to welcome you here to the National Archives, and I hope that you're going to find the discussions today and tomorrow you'll have a separate discussion with Dr. Durante. I think my part this morning is to follow on from Dr. Durante's comments and talk about how governments across the world are trying to implement, because this is a challenge faced by many, many governments today, as to how to ensure the preservation of electronic records with integrity, authenticity, for a wide range of reasons and purposes. Why is this important? Why are records important? It's very clear. The record of a nation, it's extraordinary being here and living here now in the United Arab Emirates, because I'm seeing a society which is dynamic, modern, forward-looking, but at the same time trying to recognize, carry forward the best of the traditions, of the values of a long and honored society that evolved over many centuries. And it's an interesting challenge between the modern and maintaining the tradition. And I think, obviously, Sheikh Zayed commented, a nation without a past is a nation without a present or a future. A philosopher also commented at one point that those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it. And if you want to talk examples in world history, unfortunately, there are too many examples of repeating the past and not learning from it. As well, the United Arab Emirates National Archives, a new entity established legally just 8 or 9 months ago, has had its mission statement that our mission is preserving the documentary heritage and to provide decision makers and the public with trusted information and to enhance civic spirit and national identity. That's the role of a record of archives in society. Trusted information. We all know there's a lot of garbage out on the web. And if people are learning, if young people are accessing that and learning anything from it, we're in serious trouble. Because you need trusted, reliable information as you look to evidence-based decision-making. The evidence we have, you know, is all about the past. The decisions we're making are all about the future. And that's an interesting, is our future going to be based upon solid, authentic evidence, or simply myth, old stories, and ancient tales? Archives are, and this is the old definition, records created in the course of day-to-day activity, then kept as evidence of that activity. It's the old definition. There's no great mystery to archives. That's what archives are. The records, every one of you working in an office, in a classroom, in your homes, are creating records every day. Selected, identified for what's most important, what's worth retaining, ensuring it's done in a proper environment, as Dr. Durante has outlined. It becomes part of the national heritage. It converts these routine, boring documents into a national treasure. That's what's here in the National Archives, a national treasure. Come from many sources, all media formally transferred and maintained. They are evidence of actions, decisions, and transactions. They are evidence required in defending the borders and boundaries. Anybody going to the international court to prove and talk about borders, boundaries, and ownership better have the documents there to back up that claim. International relations, the treaties, the understandings, the MOUs that are entered into across nations over long periods of time. Decision-making, evidence-based decision-making, contracts, obligations. Contracts go back decades and decades and need to be maintained. Citizenship, how do you prove citizenship? How do you prove that you're, in those countries that have engaged in ethnic cleansing, they target the record, they destroy it. Citizenship, education, demonstrate qualifications, environmental change. Look at the photographs of the UAE from the aerial photographs from the 1920s and 30s here in the archives. Look at those photographs. You can see the environment has changed. Scholarly studies, family and community to learn about the family. National achievements and pride. Anybody who's worked in the public service of the UAE over the last 30 or 40 years has seen and participated and led great changes. That documentation is essential. Electronic records are vulnerable, and I think Dr. Luciana Duranti has outlined these. There's a great quotation that I often use: in a modern office environment, electronic records last forever, or for 5 years, whichever comes first. All of us who've worked in an office have had the difficulty of finding the great version of that report you were working on. What's the final version? Where's that email where somebody told you to do something 3 years ago? Can you still find that email? But simply changing hardware and software, everybody in departments running their own little classification system on their own computer without a centralized, no version control. The new trend today, bring your own device. Everybody's bringing their tablets, their smartphones to the office. They're using those in their car. They're using those at home. Where's the official record going to be resident? How do you retrieve it? Trend to proprietary cloud storage. If any of you are using Gmail, I hope you've read the agreement you signed with Google, because you have given them ownership of everything you put into that system in perpetuity. And that's a long time. No common standards or enterprise content management. And this is not just here, this is in governments around the world. This is my experience from the Canadian government. And I think all governments are realizing now that they're vulnerable. Also, many governments are now defining records as asset. Strategic assets must be managed using a whole-of-government approach as effectively as we have traditionally managed finance, human resources, and facilities. This is a call to every manager in government, every executive in government. This is now their responsibility. In English, the term asset is a very powerful term. It carries legal implications, like protecting money as an asset. There's a lot of legal implications about money and how it's handled. Asset has a lot of implications for audit and for evaluation, for accounting. It has a value. Information's a little hard to put a monetary value on, but we do know it has a value. And I had a long fight in Ottawa to get our accountants and our Treasury Board to recognize and use the term asset in referring to information. They really balked at it. But they finally were convinced, and they recognized it. The same things happened in the United States, in Great Britain. Information record is being seen as an asset. But it's a hard one to manage. And traditionally, governments have not managed it very well. I bet all your departments have a human resource department. I bet you all have a finance department. Where's your information management department? And that's not IT. CIOs, chief information officers, have traditionally managed the systems. They manage the bells and the whistles, the bright lights and the newest technology and the hardware. That is not the asset. The asset is the content. That's where the real value lies, which is irreplaceable. You can replace the machinery, and we replace it every 5 years or as quickly as IBM can sell us on some new system. But the asset's the content. That's unique. That's irreplaceable. And it falls to every manager. Archives and records managers can help. But it is the responsibility, and that's being put into law in a number of countries, Canada, the United States, Great Britain, that it is their responsibility to manage this asset in the same way they've traditionally managed finance, human resources, and facilities. Let's just go to the United States. The latest directive, 2012, recently issued with strong authority from the President to reform records management policies and practices, noting well-managed records used to assess the impact of programs, improve business processes, share knowledge across government, permanent records document our nation's history. That's their very clear statement. And as well, share knowledge across government. That's hard. The hardest thing to do, I've found in government, certainly in Canada and the United States, is how do you share information from one department to another? And in a modern society, the issues of society are not the vertical issues of government departments. The issues of modern society go across departments. Environmental issues, defense issues, security issues involve a lot of departments, not just one. And the hardest thing to do is to share that information. This new directive applies to all records in all departments and agencies, irrespective of format or of security classification. And to the fullest extent possible, agencies will eliminate paper and use electronic record keeping, to the point that they need plans in place to be completed by the year 2019 to consider to maintain electronic record keeping. In Canada, the National Archives have said they will not accept paper records after the year 2017. It's very close. There's real challenge there to convert to electronic record keeping practices and demonstrate compliance with records legislation. Use generic record schedules for common administrative records, those relating to human resources, finance, audit, facilities. Those records are common to every department, every entity of government. Just have one common classification system and one common record system across all of government. We need to train staff across all of government. For the United States, the United Arab Emirates, Canada, very common approaches. A formal, authoritative renewal of the importance of record keeping for program effectiveness and collaboration, emphasis on dealing with paper records while moving to e-government, renewing records policies, engagement with key budget offices to ensure compliance, work with all the central agencies of government. In Canada, we found the finance people and who are concerned about efficiency, and auditors who are concerned about accountability to the government. They're very concerned about the state of record keeping. Records seen as government assets, and you implement an asset management process. You manage records as assets, and it's a senior management responsibility. It's got to be driven home to all executives, all managers. This is their responsibility. The National Archives here is undertaking a number of actions. We have to clear the path. We're moving to M-government very quickly. Tremendous. But did you know that right now there are at least 9 million box files of paper in the government entities of the United Arab Emirates? 9 million. That's a huge drag. It's a huge weight. It's a huge cost center. It's a huge source of inefficiency as we try to find older records and find what did we decide 2 weeks ago. That has to be managed. We need to clear the path so that we can move forward with a very efficient, open, accessible M-government. So we're reviewing the policies and procedures, developing a record storage and preservation center so that we can move records out of offices, get them under control, winnow them down to, over time, to about the 5%, 10% of records that are worth retaining permanently. Training program, developing a training program to deal with paper records, developing a major data center to enable routine transfer of important e-records, so we can move them from departments to that trusted third party, the National Archives that Dr. Durante was referring to ensure their long-term preservation. The challenge, and frankly, it's the challenge in just about every government I've encountered, how do we drive a corporate one-time project to control paper records? Drive it, urgency. We want M-government, we want that paper tidied up, we need it cleared away, we need to have the most important parts digitized. Drive a one-off project right across the government. Get everybody engaged, everybody involved, almost a cleanup day. Let's have a cleanup week. Let's deal with the paper 1 week with trained staff. And the other challenge, and we've kicked this around this week, a few of us, in talking with Dr. Durante, maybe it's a broader issue. I'd be curious to work with partners to create the UAE cloud for secure permanent e-records. You don't use iCloud, you don't use Amazon, you don't use Google, you don't use the others because frankly you lose control. So why don't we have a UAE cloud where we would have secure, careful preservation, protection of our records and ensure their accessibility for this generation of administrators, for this government, and for the very long-term future. And a final word, and I think it's common to at least the governments I can treat. I could do a dozen other governments, but it's the same issue across the world. But this is what the Cabinet Secretary in Canada wrote just a year or two ago. The public service of tomorrow will be defined by a number of key characteristics. Achieving excellence in all that we do will require our institution to be collaborative, innovative, streamlined, high-performing, adaptable, and diverse. The one thing about all of those attributes is that they all involve information. They all involve records. It's all about collaboration. You can't collaborate unless you're exchanging information. Innovative, you need to know where you've been. Streamlined, how do you simplify? How do you deal with business process improvement without streamlining the systems and the processes? High-performing and adaptable and diverse. It's all about record keeping. I should say there was one other word that the Cabinet Secretary used, which is the only time I've ever heard the head of a public service use this term. He said, we have to do all this, but we should do it with courage. Courage. This involves risk-taking, and it involves new ways of doing things. It involves collaboration across the system. But that's what the public expects. It's what the public needs, what the public wants, and it's the kind of services we need to deliver. So I think we go forward with courage and develop this record-keeping system and maybe a UAE cloud. Thank you very much.
أيها الحضور الكريم، باسمكم جميعا نشكر الدكتور إيان ويلسون على محاضرته القيمة. والآن نترك المجال أمام استفساراتكم وأسئلتكم، فمن لديه سؤال فليتفضل.
Anyway, while we wait for you to get up your courage to ask a question, let me ask Dr. Durante a very unfair question. You've learned a lot in the last few days about the archives and the UAE government. What would you recommend? First steps, how do we move forward in this area?
You need to have courage to educate people. I think that any issue has to be solved primarily through education. And certainly one can start slowly with training and move forward to more complex ways, but education is essential as well as research. And I think participation in research in the world community is extremely important, because the issues that are specific to you would be addressed within research projects that otherwise maybe wouldn't consider them, and because it would give you the capacity to address your own issues once you are more involved and aware of what everybody else is doing. And certainly to avoid the mistakes that everybody else has made, because I think that that is the greatest advantage of collaboration in research, is to see what everybody else has done wrong and not to fall into the same trap. And then to build things together. And undoubtedly, the challenges are so big and so fast coming at us, because once we think we are there, the new thing comes up, that we need to be ready to hit the ground running, I think.
Thank you. Other questions? You must have questions.
Good morning.
Yes. Okay. Do we have a microphone or?
I think the
Yeah, Sue. Is there, yeah, up there, I
Yeah.
think the microphone's right up here. Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum.
No?
Good morning. Is this clear? I'm not sure. Yeah. My name is Wafa Naimi. I'm from the Zoo and Aquarium Institute, Public Institute in Al Ain. I am responsible of the information security section in Al Ain Zoo. My question is, how can we in information security function and IT function can help elaborate such difficult projects or activity? Thank you.
Let me repeat your question to see whether I have understood what you need to know. Okay, so you want to know in which way we can protect the digital material in a secure way. Okay, well, there are, yes?
Yes. And how can IT help facilitate to choose the right solution for this? And of course, to be secure.
Okay.
Thank you.
So there are three things to consider. First of all, whether you have the material in-house or you have it online, because those are completely different requisites that you need to have. Second thing is what is the function of security? Is to prevent alteration, or it is to discover it, because IT security has focused a lot on firewalls, encryptions, access privileges, and these are all the classic measures that are taken. However, it has not focused in discovering when the breach has occurred and when, in fact, the records have been altered. And there are methodologies to do this. The answers exist. But certainly, the hardest are the technological measures that you use. The more difficult will be to maintain the material over time. For example, no archival institution in the world accepts encrypted material. There is no way, because you cannot normalize it to the archival environment. You cannot keep converting it and migrating it in an easy way. So there are mathematical means of protection, but there are procedural ones that are preferred over everything else. In fact, the continuing unbroken line of custody is the most reliable way of protecting the records, is when you put them under an officer of primary responsibility and from there to the next without ever breaking that chain. So the other thing about security that has come out through time is that it is better to have 10 imperfect ways of protecting the records than having one foolproof method, because those who want to get in there will. But if you have several methods that consist mostly in giving different responsibilities procedurally for different parts of the record, then it gets easier. But security is a bigger issue in the cloud. It is not so much in an in-house environment. If you have the servers with you and you don't have material online, it is harder to breach security. But if you have material online, that's where you need the big stratification of security measures. And there are lots. There is the Cloud Security Alliance that has a magnificent website with lots of documents which help to establish the right way of, for you, because every organization has a different right way of doing the things, right? And the Cloud Security Alliance is a member of the Inter Pares project because they know that even their extremely sophisticated means cannot beat somebody who is determined to breach into your system. In fact, I was at the conference of the Security Alliance in Reading in October, and all the experts there in computer systems said that the probability of breaching the cloud is 1. You know what that means? It's not 95%, it's 1. That is, the breach will occur, no matter what. It's a question of when, not whether if. However, what you can do is to make sure that you minimize the consequences.
Okay, there were questions down here in the second row.
Thank you very much for the very informative speeches from both of you. My name is Kebrى from the Higher Colleges of Technology. My question is regarding the preservation of digital records. And I wonder if you can give us some thoughts about the databases that we use today. Are they really adequate? We're using products that has been invented maybe 4 decades ago, relational databases, and they're still in the hearts of most systems today. And if not, what would be a suitable way forward? Thank you.
Well, databases are actually the easiest one of the digital systems to preserve, because what you need to do to preserve databases is just to make sure that the content remains fixed, and so do the tables. That's what you have to do. And if you want to preserve only part of a database, you just establish what are the queries to which you need answers, right? So why you're preserving the database? For what specific purposes? Once you have defined the purposes, then you see what are the queries that are addressed by those in order to achieve those purposes, and you freeze all the tables related to the specific thing. And then you extract it from the live database and you save it as an entity. So databases are not difficult to save. What are difficult to save are more dynamic systems. The ones that continue, that have a continuing flow of data into them and overwrite the previous ones. Those are the hardest one, but databases are easy. That's not, and yes, most of the world now deals with databases. So there was a gentleman here and one there.
We got a microphone.
Okay.
Hello? Yeah. Can I start or?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. My name is Fatma Mrehi. I'm from ADNOC, Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. I'm heading the Department for Electronic Documentation, Document Management. I would like to know about the challenges that I'm facing at the moment. We already have our archiving department established, and it was established since late 90s. So we already have the records already archived in our archiving facility. So now the electronic documentation or archiving terminology just came up, and we're trying to find ourselves. Shall we start over, or as Dr. Dolenti was recommending, it has to start from the beginning of the process of archiving, but we are actually starting while the archive is already there. So shall we start from now? And but what about the previous records that we had?
Okay, so the reason why I put this on is that this makes the microphone so much louder. So it's hard to hear this way, but with this it is easier. So anyway, of course you have to preserve what you have. So what you have to think two ways. One is, how do I keep what I already have preserved in my archives throughout the new generations of technology? So you need to continue constantly upgrading this system. So one error that many organizations make is to wait that the system becomes almost obsolete, and then they buy a new one. That is the most expensive proposition you can think of, and most of the times you wouldn't get the money, and the conversion is never as accurate as it would be after a short time. So the best strategy is to have every year in your budget the money for upgrading. And you upgrade on a rotation all the components of the system constantly, so that you don't have a problem of compatibility ever. And the system remains interoperable through time. So that's what you do with what you have, okay? At the same time, you have to think that you have to preserve the records that are being generated now.
Sorry, Doctor, there is one misunderstanding in this. We used to have the manual way of archiving. We didn't implement any system of electronic archiving. So our status at the moment is initiating or implementing and starting now the electronic archiving. We used to have the original traditional archiving
Paper.
before. Paper, yes.
Oh, so you're talking about paper.
So we
you have
used
the
to have
archives
the
on
paper before, and we are initiating the electronic technologies at the moment.
Okay, the archives on paper, you keep them on paper.
Okay.
That's what you do.
So, okay.
You may want to digitize them for access purposes.
Yes,
but
exactly.
not to destroy the originals. Don't even think of destroying the originals, because those are the records that are evidence of the activity. If you want to move from a paper situation to a digital situation in the current archives, what you have to do is to establish a digitization process at the moment of creation. That is, every record that comes in every day on paper, you digitize it and you work on it as a digital record, rather than working on the paper record. That's what you do. But the material that you have already archived as paper records, you don't destroy after digitization. Those are your records and that's your evidence. You only use digitization for two reasons. One is to provide access, mostly online access, to the material, and the other reason is to protect them for conservation reason, that is so that they don't wear out. And for consultation, you rather give the digital one than the paper one. But that's the only way you use digitization when you have a paper environment. If you want to create a brand new digital environment, then you create born digital records where you can, and where the law still requires you, or the procedure, to have records on paper, you generate on paper, you digitize them right away, and you work your procedure on the digitized version. Then after that, you can destroy the paper records. Because your record is the digital version, because you have worked on it, with it, through time. Does it make sense?
Yes. Thank you, Doctor.
Okay.
Coming down in front here.
I am Abdullah Shamsi. I am head of IT section from Department of President Affairs. First of all, I want to thank you for the important knowledge that you present today. My question I want to ask, what's the role will play from the National Archives to help different Abu Dhabi sectors to implement the best practice of archiving? For example, do you have a plan to have a team in the future to visit different ministries in Abu Dhabi to help these ministries to implement best practice and standards? Because, for example, I can look into different websites and read these standards, but how I will make sure I implement these standards in the perfect ways? And how I will be in touch with the new technology and archiving system?
Okay. Do you want to answer?
Yeah, I think in terms of the National Archives' ability to get out to all departments and agencies, they're in process of doing that, and our experts are available if you wish to set up an arrangement. I think Ms. Sama Al-Mansouri, who is here, who spoke earlier, is head of the Archives Department. She could help arrange for that, but we're still beginning processes here to accommodate and address the electronic record. And that's what this symposium is really starting off and launching this conversation, as well as we learn and put in place the policies and procedures needed to create the electronic record, while at the same time sorting out, tidying up the paper record as we move forward. So, thank you. And there was another question behind you. Did you want to?
Yes, salam.
Yeah, you also asked how do you remain up to date? And you remain up to date by participating in research. That's how you do. So it would be good if the National Archives had representative in research projects so that they know exactly what goes on all the time. But also you go to conferences and you try to be in contact with those who conduct research and are at, that one step ahead.
Yeah, Abdullah Al-Janibi from Social Care and Minor Affairs. I'd like to ask about the project, Inter-Paris project. You mentioned that you started without a budget first year. What was the challenges in this project starting? You started without a project. Is there any challenges?
When the project started in '98, was the fact that we had just developed the standard for record-keeping system, and we had started generating records in this new digital environment, and we didn't have a clue on how to keep them and maintain them over time. So that was the challenge, and we put all our heads together, and we started testing various hypotheses. And that's the great contributions that archival institutions as well as government agencies can provide to research, because you can put a bunch of academics together to discuss things, but they will not know whether they work in reality until they test them. And so an alliance between academics, universities, students who can do the data collection, agencies, and National Archives in working together solutions, but then trying them out and see what works and what doesn't work, and what new challenges are coming up. That's the vital part. That's what takes research forward. And once you have created this environment of collaboration, of understanding, all your colleagues are your resources, because tomorrow you get a problem at the National Archives, but at this point you are so involved with colleagues in the National Archives the world over that you just make a phone call. It becomes your network. What we have created with Inter-Paris research since '98 has been this gigantic network in which, for example, the students start in this network for helping professors to collect data, but then they become themselves professionals. They become themselves researchers. or they become heads of agencies that become themselves partners in research. So it's the network that supports the entire environment. That's why it is so important to participate in research, is because where you can't, somebody else will help you.
There was one more question here.
Yes, this is Abdullah Hashim from الاتصالات. Thank you very much for the informative presentation. I think my questions to Dr. Wilson. Just want to ask, are you working in developing a national strategy for really try to digitize the and archiving the content? Because you mentioned some challenges, you know, there are some issues in policy as well in technical and technology. Also, we understand, I mean, we know that the National Archive has launched the national initiative, WATHA, which is really document the personal records. And the way it's now, I think, my understanding to based on the booklets, that you distribute in boxes where people still manually put their documents. We know that's already some people and some either even governments, official people are really putting their documents, pictures in Instagram and so on. You know, I'm just wondering, I mean, you're talking about digitization, but at the same time, you're doing this manual things. If there is a first national strategy, and I think being a national archives, you know, you're gonna take these roles and just give us some insight if you're working this national strategy or something you need to develop and who is involved, which the stakeholders and so on. You mentioned there are some challenges like about the cloud and data centers. I think as a country here in UAE, we have the good infrastructure, we have the data centers, we have the cloud. Technology could be a challenge, but maybe not really the main challenge. It's really the awareness and how to bring all stakeholders together and put the national strategy.
Thank you for that question. I think it's very practical and a very useful question because we're still in very early days. The National Archives itself is really relatively new in that role, and it's still working to develop it. The new initiative in terms of making archival boxes available, I think 300,000 boxes with thumb drives in those boxes and file folders inviting all families to look at how to maintain their important memories is a useful initiative to move out from just the official record of government, but also to look at all of society. I think in terms of national strategy, it's still evolving, and I think in terms of the Archives Executive Director and managers who are here, I think we need to have that conversation about the partnerships. We've already started some of those discussions this week. We'll be getting back to you on how to engage a lot of the partners who are very actively working in this field, and how do we come up with one that respects not just the dissemination and access, but also the very long-term preservation of the key information from that. So thank you for that.
So I'd like to be, if you want, you know, we're willing to partner with you in whatever the strategy develops, especially in the technical side.
Thank you. We've taken note of that, and we'll be in touch. Appreciate it. I'm going to suggest at this point, it's very hard to see with these lights, just if there are any other hands, but we have a lunch just out, a light lunch available out in the lobby. I'd like to suggest we continue this conversation with Dr. Durante out in the lobby, have a bite to eat before we go back to work. I would want to note that this afternoon we will be placing Dr. Durante's talk in both English and Arabic, plus all of her PowerPoint slides that have also been translated into Arabic. Those will be going online on the National Archives website. I hope all of you have visited the new National Archives website, na.ae, very simple, and we'll be putting these resources. This is the very first time that, while Dr. Durante has been leading a broad international consultation, this is the very first time that this material is becoming available in Arabic. So we want to share it with our colleagues across the Arab countries and invite them to get engaged, to think about, to work on some of the projects and some of the research, develop the terminology and advance that for developing practices around electronic records. I think this has been a very useful morning. I want to thank all of you for coming here, for taking time, for your interest, evident interest. And I think it's showing us that there is a community that archives can work with to build upon. So thank you all very much.
في الختام لا يسعنا إلا أن نشكركم جميعا على حضوركم وحسن متابعتكم، وأنتم جميعا مدعوون إلى وجبة خفيفة، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.